I am the owner and principal consultant at Higher Learning Group, Education Consulting. Um, that's a long way of saying I teach teachers, students, and parents how to navigate schools and how to ensure that they are getting optimal experiences no matter their race, no matter their class, no matter their religion, or if they represent a marginalized group in a school community or in a school system. It's my job to come in and help to empower them to use their voices to make sure that they're getting the best education they could possibly get, that they are advocating for themselves. In the case of parents, their children, and teachers are teaching a curriculum that's empowering for all children. So that's what I do. And it comes with, you know, a lot of stress, but mostly it comes with a lot of pride in what I do. I always wanted to be in a position not only to have my own business, um, but mostly to be in a position where I felt that I was making a contribution in the field of education beyond the classroom, which is where I started, and which is sometimes where where I wish I still was, because in the classroom is where the real work happens every day, in and out, day in and day out, for teachers working one-on-one with students, being able to have that direct connection. I do miss, but it was always my dream to go from that point to a point where maybe even start to even start my own school, or to work on a systemic level in education. So I feel very blessed. And the end of the story is, I'm gonna tell you that at the beginning, which is, I'm here. I'm at a point in my career where I can say, um, everything that I've done up to this point feels like it's led me to this place. And while it's not perfect, and while I don't quite feel like I'm finished yet, still have a lot of work to do, because schools are still, facing, and children of color, Black children, Black, brown children, all over this country are facing tremendous challenges to this day. So obviously the work is not over, but I definitely feel like I'm in a position now to be an influencer. So how did I get here? As I said, I started my career in the classroom as a teacher, as an educator. I graduated from Morgan State University, my beloved alma mater. I can't tell you how transformative Morgan in my years there was to my preparation as a professional, as a teacher, and my formation as a human being, my development as a young woman, as a Black woman. I pledged a sorority when I was there, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Um, I received a Fulbright fellowship as a result of a mentor at Morgan who took me under his wing, Dr. Sandy McIntyre, and lived in Korea and taught English in South Korea for a year as a result of the Fulbright program. Morgan has many Fulbright scholars who have taught and worked all over the world, and has a reputation for producing more Fulbright scholars than nearly any university in the country, not just any HBCU, but any university. So had I not gone to Morgan, I would not have had so many opportunities, and I would not be the person that I am today. So I owe Morgan a debt of gratitude. I gotta give shout outs, and I have to give shout outs also to HBCUs in general, for making that happen for so many of us. And so with a passion for teaching, I graduated from Morgan, went overseas with my braids and my poetic justice braids now, because this was the 90s. And I was a big fan of everything 90s, like we all were back then, the Janet Jackson look and poetic justice. I'm just getting a visual because I was definitely a standout in Jeju-do, South Korea, walking around with those braids, freshly out of college, out of a all Black university. Now, the only person of color that was not Korean, um, and one of very few Americans who were civilians, because there were American military bases in Seoul. And I can tell you some stories about that too, because Seoul was on and pop, and they had uh, um, sororities and fraternities on the American military basis. I was able to fly up to Seoul from the little island where I lived in Korea, and hang out with my sorority sisters who were living in Korea as military, and other brothers of other fraternities, and African American organizations that were based there. They had fast food there, so that was kind of my outlet. But I digress. Most of my time was spent teaching on a little island called Jeju-do. I had learned a little Korean before leaving the States, and learned a little more when I got to Korea through the Fulbright program, like a crash course. And so I had my basics, I had my 감사합니다s and my 안녕하세요 and my 영어로 선생님입니다. I am an English teacher. Thank you. Hello. 미국 사람입니다. I am American. So I still 20 years later remember just that, not very much, but I remember my basic Korean. And my job was to not only be my main job was to be an English teacher in a Korean middle school. And I lived with a Korean family while I was there. And it was great because I always wanted to be a teacher. When I graduated from Morgan, I thought I was going to teach in the States, secondary education, middle school or high school. And the Fulbright just kind of came, as a bonus, again, because of Morgan and a professor there who was really, really keen on making sure that Morgan students had those opportunities. So I had that great international experience. And so I was the English kind of cultural language speaker. So I was the teacher that taught pronunciation, idiomatic expressions, things that a person who isn't fully fluent in a conversational way with the English language, could teach. So, there was a Korean teacher there who obviously was the grammar expert and the person who was fluent enough in Korean to be able to teach students English using Korean. So being able to explain in Korean English terms, but might not have had, the proper accent or the proper inflection, or may not have understood certain expressions like chip off the old block, or, various, cultural idiomatic expressions and things that you only learn when you really, really know a language, and not only a language, but the culture in which that language is being spoken. So American English, for example, and the expressions that go along with that, as opposed to British English. So that being said, my job was to, help them sound as fluent, like a native speaker as I could, so we did a lot of things like watching American films, and then we would act out scenes from the film so they could say the words and kind of, with the proper pronunciation, but not just standard English. Proper pronunciation, meaning if I'm speaking slang, this is how I speak. If I'm speaking in a job interview, this is how I speak. So it was a great school because they really understood how to teach language. And so as an educator, and particularly as an English teacher, because that's what I studied at Morgan, I was going to teach English literature. I didn't know I was going to be teaching ESL, but I definitely appreciated that experience was another way to understand how people really learn English. One way is the way we learned it as native speakers. You learn grammar in school, and you learn, you take some courses and maybe, writing the essay, and, maybe some creative writing, and you read literature, in which, the English language is employed to tell a story. So the way we learn English in your English classes in middle school and high school is one way, but to learn how people who are not native speakers learn English and to understand what really is at the bedrock of language was very interesting to me. So I spent some time, um, traveling while I was in Korea. I didn't just stay in Korea the whole time. I went to Australia and I went to Japan. I went to China. I did a lot of traveling. When I was on my breaks, I traveled with some of the other teachers um, who were a part of the same program that I was in, the Fulbright program, and we had a great time. So I was learning a lot about myself. I was learning a lot about teaching. I was learning a lot about human nature and cultures and international experiences, seeing a lot of things. And it just fed my desire to learn more and to go back to school. So when I came back to the States, after having kind of that whirlwind international experience right after undergrad, I actually was accepted to Harvard's Graduate School of Education and received my master's from Harvard. There again, my horizons were expanded once more, really getting into lots of education theory and also though getting into inequities in education and why some kids are really benefiting from the American education system and why some aren't, why some are winning and some are quite frankly losing, and it's not their fault in all situations. The systemic racism, the bias, the outdated kind of approaches, the lack of fundamental change and radical change in education. Some of those ideas, they started at Morgan in a sense, and then living abroad, also kind of seeing, Asian education system, very different from America. My students bowed to me every single time I came in the room in Korea. Didn't get that when I was doing my student teaching at, Forest Park in Baltimore, or, the local places, middle schools and high schools where I taught in the States as a part of my teaching program. So again, all these things are percolating around, like what are the cultural influences on education, particularly in how people learn English and study English. um, Language itself, just thinking about like, African American vernacular and dialects, and versus what people consider standard English and Queen's English, and code switching, and how we go back and forth. And I can jazz it up. I can, talk to my friends in a certain way. And for kids, this is very relevant because they're doing this all the time, right? They're code switching all the time. So getting back to the Harvard experience, it was just another level of, or another approach. I won't say level, but another perspective on education systems, cultural dynamics in education. I took a lot of courses on not only linguistics, but also on um, you know education theories around inequities in education systems. How funding is um, distributed in legislation that fuels, and policy that fuels education, and how all those policies and the funding streams and historic um, kind of patterns of racism and discrimination continue to influence how children throughout our country are learning today or not learning today. So, with all of that, I landed my first teaching job in after graduating from Harvard, thinking I was going to come back to Baltimore and teach in Baltimore City public schools, where I was ready and excited to teach and work with Black children primarily, and to give back to my home city, because that's the city that groomed me and raised me, and I wanted to give back. And that's another thing that HBCUs teach you. Morgan definitely taught that. And I was courted. I'm just going to be honest. I was courted by private schools. They wanted diversity. They wanted a Black Harvard graduate, Fulbright scholar to teach in their private school. And I did not intend on kind of getting caught up. I actually was very conflicted, um, and went back and forth and even told them in my interview, like, I don't know if I really want to. I don't even know if I want to teach in these spaces. Like, this isn't what I signed up for. They don't, there weren't any other Black teachers, in my department. There maybe were one or two in the school where I ended up teaching. But they wined and dined the sister, literally. They flew me in from Boston. They interviewed me. Like, when does a teacher ever get flown in? I wasn't like an NBA player. You know, they told me how, there were Black students, there were brown students in those private schools, and they didn't have any role models that looked like them. And somebody basically had to be the first, and somebody had to come in there even and show, the white children who hadn't had these experiences of having a Black teacher. I was the first Black teacher that many of them had. And this was in the 90s. I'm not talking about like the 60s. Like, it's serious. Like, schools are resegregated. Y'all know that, but I just had to say that. So, like, we're still breaking like really basic color barriers in many industries, and education is in that industry is improving. But certainly when it comes to the private public school divide, particularly in cities like Baltimore, extreme and overt segregation based on zip code, funding, you name it. Schools break down right across those lines. So anyway, the pioneer spirit in me, the person that says, all right, I'll try this and I'll make a difference where I am, right? I will grow where I am planted. And eventually I will take all of the goodies that I've learned in these private schools that, quite frankly, they're doing well. They're sustainable. They have a strong model. They have almost 100% college acceptance rates. All of their kids go to college. They have small classes. They have all kinds of things that I had studied as highly effective in order for any school to be successful in serving children. And so I was like, okay, even though this is not where I thought I was going to teach, I will teach in these schools and I will learn basically how they work, how they operate. And I will try to take that whole model, bottle it, and start my own school with my own, community, and have the benefit of all these experiences to bring to a school setting. And so I worked as an English teacher, high school English teacher, for 1 year. Then it became 5 years. Then I looked up and it was, I don't know, 16 years, 17 years, and I'm still teaching. But I'm not just teaching. I have gotten numerous promotions. I was an administrator in a private school, an independent school here in Baltimore for many years. I was, given leadership opportunities, dean of students, and I was also doing diversity and equity programs in those schools. So advocating for more teachers of color to be hired, advocating for the curriculum to be diversified, and even in the English department where I worked, I continued to work making sure the books were reflective of diverse cultural backgrounds of children. All backgrounds can see themselves in the things that they were reading, that we had African American authors and African American storylines and Latinx authors and storylines, that we had women, 100% women represented in the curriculum, so that we were kind of breaking down the, old white men canon of literature in the schools, and particularly in the English classes. And as you can see in the background, I'm a lover of books, particularly African American literature and African American figures and African American women writers and men, but obviously a near and dear and relatable for me are Black women and their stories. So, having had all these different jobs in private schools, teacher, administrator, diversity director, dean of students, I even coached for a couple of years because I had played basketball and volleyball back in the day. I felt like I was ready and there are a lot of horror stories in there. Like, I'm kind of glossing over because I'm not sure how much time I have, but um, I was put through the ringer. I had students who were transferred out of my class, mostly because their parents didn't want them to have a Black teacher. I had colleagues of mine challenge my education credentials, even though my credentials were better than their credentials. They had to be, because a Black woman breaking into that very white, affluent space in that kind of school, you know, meant that I had to be exceptional. You know how as Black women, as always, you know, you got to be 150% better than the person next to you, even to be seen. So I knew that I belonged there. Um, but I still had to have a thick skin because a lot of other people didn't think I belonged there. And I used that to teach my children, you know, my students. It was the first school where I worked, private school, was an all girls school. So even working with, you know, young white women, um, you know, the storyline is, you know, you're going to have to prove yourself as a woman. You know, there are legit gender, you know, discriminatory practices around gender. But when you add race to it, it changes the entire ballgame. So, you know, just really using my platform as a teacher, working with girls of all races, to empower them, and to be that example, and, you know, taking the knocks myself in that space, but also using those experiences to help them so that they wouldn't have to take the knocks, or if they did, they would be ready for them. They would be prepared, more than prepared, because they would have to be. So, you know, after, like I said, nearly 20 years of doing diversity work as a diversity and equity coordinator in private schools, which is, you know, everything from, you know, as I said before, looking at hiring practices in the school, looking at the diversity in the faculty and the administration and on the board level, and trying to advocate for greater representation in those spaces, and more of an agenda focused on, and long-term plan, and bringing in more people, because these are spaces that for, you know, over a century in many cases, you know, most of these schools in this area were founded in like you know, the 1860s. So they were founded on exclusive practices, like it's in the water. So in order to really change the tide of those schools, so that the schools come around to the new face that their schools literally need to have, and the new community of people that they need to serve, and the new things that they need to teach, so that children who are graduating today are really ready for a multicultural world, and are just ready, period, who are strong, who are confident, who know who they are, who have a sense of self. Like, it's a lot of retrofitting that has to happen. So that's what diversity practitioners do in, many of these school spaces. You may have heard of like chief diversity officers in companies. They do things like looking at hiring practices. I looked at the same thing, but in schools. Um, you know, as I move through my years there, um, I said I could do this on my own. I could do this on my own. I had like one too many, you know, arguments, you know, with my head of school about, you know, wanting to see more diversity, wanting to see more equitable practices, wanting to see more Black children in advanced placement courses, you know, wanting to see, you know, more Black people on the board of trustees, wanting to see the school really look at the curriculum and what they're teaching and what they're omitting, the lies, the untruths, the historic, you know, African history that's not being told, that, you know, putting on the pedestal the white male canon still when it came. So having had those conversations way too many times for way too long, and don't get me wrong, I had lots of positive experiences in those schools too, with leaders as well. And I wouldn't have stayed as long as I did, as it if it were totally unbearable. Um, I stayed mostly for the students though, and the families, because many of them were coming into these spaces like, this is very different. This is not, you know, the prep school world is a thing. It's a thing. So anyway, I knew I could do it on my own. I had been a teacher and an educational consultant of sorts for many years anyway, just wasn't doing it on my own. I was working for somebody else. And I said, I can do this. I can leverage all my contacts, and I can teach workshops, and I can, you know, help schools to reinvent their curricula in the ways that I always wanted to see, the schools where I worked reinvent their curricula. I can help teachers who are struggling, to really, advocate for and see, come to life their dreams for what they want to teach, and how they want to teach, and not be pigeonholed by hackneyed, outdated education practices that were stifling their creativity as teachers. So how can I help teachers unlock their inner magic, teach what they want to teach, and do it in a way that, number one, obviously, edifies the children that they're teaching, but number two, that really kind of shakes things up in the school, so that the school can recognize, hey, you need to teach for the new millennium, not for the past. So working with teachers, helping them to, see, and also to see their blind spots, particularly working with teachers who have worked in traditionally white, typically white settings, majority white settings, and just were struggling to teach children of color. I mean, that happened way too often, seeing teachers who were good teachers, in terms of their fundamentals, like just totally dropped the ball when it came to teaching our kids. Like, how could you think that was okay to say to that child? Or why aren't you as effective with our children as you are with, white children? Like, what's going on? Like, don't your cultural competence is nil. And so how to help teachers who were just waking up to whiteness, waking up to race, waking up to how it plays out every day, every minute of the day for Black and brown children who are coming into these white spaces thinking they were getting a top education, a high quality education, because it was some fancy rich prep school, but not being seen by their teachers. Not really, not being understood, not being called on, not being, recommended, for the accelerated section, or, not being understood when they had a disciplinary issue, it being totally blown out of proportion because, the racial dynamic was right there. Putting children into categories because of their race. Oh, if you're African American male, you probably are a good athlete, not necessarily a scholar, like dismantling all that. So basically, that is what I'm blessed to be able to do now. I started Higher Learning Group in 2015. And my wins, 2020, I have been profitable. It's another myth. It's because you're in a nonprofit field like education doesn't mean that you can't make a living. I'm not saying that I'm rich, because I'm not, but what I'm saying is it's still a business, and I don't do this for charity. I do this to make a living, and I happen to do something that I feel good about at night that I do for a living. I feel like it's a noble thing to do for a living. And as a small business owner, they always say it's going to take you 2-3 years in order to be profitable. And my biggest win is because I had such a long history in the field that I started doing this consulting work in. I came into the entrepreneur side of things basically with a whole, Rolodex of contacts and people who had worked with me for many years in the past and were more than happy to support me now that I was venturing out on my own. So I could basically make the same salary and do the same work as I was doing because I already had almost 20 years in that same field. I just was doing it for somebody else. So I say it like that so that people know, wow, I'm not real, some people say, well, I'm not really making money in my business yet. It's going to take me a while to build up capital to do this, to do that. I'm fortunate that wasn't my story. But again, I had paid my dues for a really long time in that field. And, for somebody else that might not be the path, that was just my path. And it ended up being a big win for me. I probably should have done it long before I did it, but I did finally cut those apron strings and go out on my own. But the biggest win was not that I was able to kind of stand on my own 2 feet and be sustainable in my business. The biggest win is I got to do the work I always wanted to do, and I got to have a voice in a way that I never had a chance to have a voice, because even though I was doing work that was based on advocacy, which meant I had to speak loudly and I had to say things that made people uncomfortable. And I had to, kind of go out on my own and talk about, controversial, so to speak, topics like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and empowering people from those communities, which for some are, uncomfortable, controversial, provocative topics. Even though, my role, even when I worked in schools, was to be provocative in certain ways, I still could only go but so far in those conversations, or I had to think about my job. Because you can't, you have to create um, a dynamic in which you are speaking with honesty, truth, and clarity, but at the same time, making sure that you are doing the work of the person who's paying you. And so that was a delicate balance, because sometimes the person whose toes I had to step on were the people who were signing my paychecks. As a teacher, it's the same thing. As a teacher, you have to teach the to the curriculum of that school. You have to follow the guidelines, principles, mores, protocols of that school. A certain point you can shut your door and you can, lean in and really be real with kids, and say the things to them that they need to hear, and teach the things they need to learn. But you can't do that at the expense of your job, or your students lose out because they don't have you anymore. And obviously you lose out. So it's a delicate dance. So the biggest win was once I came out on my own. Hey, I can say what I want to say pretty much. No, shoot, you can still lose business. It's not like there's no consequences. But definitely I felt like I could write my own agenda in terms of, um, you know, what I needed to say without the backlash. And people were inviting me in. So they already know what I was going to talk about. So very rarely did anybody get upset when it was hard hitting, because they wouldn't have asked me if they really didn't want me to be there. So that's the biggest win. And I've already talked about, we were told to talk about some challenges. I've talked about the challenges specifically doing diversity work, because when you're doing diversity work as a person of color and as a woman, you are the diversity, and you're advocating for more diversity for other people who are in your school or in your company or in your government, office or bureau. So you're living it. Like you're getting the daggers thrown at you every day too. You're being asked to be the example, or you're being asked to, you know, um, be a leader, even though you're hitting the glass ceiling all day long yourself. And then at the same time, you're advocating for other people so that they aren't hitting the glass ceiling, and you're talking to the powers that be to make sure those dynamics don't exist. So you're taking it from both sides. And that is the biggest challenge of this specific work that I do. As an entrepreneur, the biggest challenge is, particularly as a consultant, I do work from contract to contract. So while I've been fortunate and I've been able to kind of sustain a steady flow of business and people, hiring me to do workshops for them, or webinars, or to design a curriculum, or to design a program around diversity and equity, multicultural program, speakers to come into schools, student conferences. I did for 20 years, I just stepped down, but for 20 years, I ran a conference called the Baltimore Student Diversity Leadership Conference that brought 500 high school students together annually to talk specifically about their experience as children of color in schools. And we trained the students to run the workshops for the conference. So it was a trainer kind of program, but with young people. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm hired to do, to organize conferences, workshops, webinars. And now I'm doing that work virtually. Um, because of COVID. But the biggest challenge is, making sure that, you're continuing to grow your business. You're continuing to stay relevant, stay fresh, marketing, just you live contract to contract essentially. And so you have to be ready for the times when you don't get a contract and you get to save up. Might be having a good year this year. I might have had a good run for the last few years, but that doesn't mean next year isn't going to be, totally different, and things won't dry up. So you have to, kind of you got to stay fresh. And that's a big challenge, especially when you're an ideas person like I am. And I don't really want to think about the business. I don't want to think about the business side at all. I don't want to think about the accounting. I don't want to think about, social media marketing. Like none of those things are interesting to me. But they're essential to my business. I'm more interested in, solving big problems in education. I want to sit down and, you know, think about what's going on, how we can help. I want to roll my sleeves up and go out into the community like we've been doing throughout COVID, and, feeding school children who, were used to getting their basic meals at school, and now the school is closed. One of my contracts involves food distributions at schools. So working with schools, and again, it has a diversity angle, but it's not exactly the same kind of diversity work as I was doing before. But, one of the shifts of COVID, in addition to doing everything virtually, so workshops like this, figuring out how to do them online, but also figuring out how to serve children in a virtual space, particularly children who have great needs beyond school. So home insecurity, housing insecurity, food insecurity, and how school served as a stabilizing force for children in those situations. And so when there's no school, it's not just like no teaching and no learning, it's also no food. It's also maybe not a warm place to go during the day, when your electricity is turned off and you don't have any heat, right? So when the school closes down, for many children, and again, this is why it's a diversity issue, because it's talking about equity in education. School shouldn't be doing all that in the lives of a child. School is not responsible for feeding, so in some cases providing clothing. I definitely have been in situations where we were raising money so kids will have uniforms, or raising money for washers and dryers so that we could wash kids' uniforms that were filthy because they didn't have a way to wash them or nobody to wash their uniforms. So they were coming to school with dirty uniforms, they were smelly, and they were getting teased. So that's still an education issue, still an equity issue. And COVID has amplified those issues. So the work that I'm still doing somewhat in private schools is more about access to the schools, access to those communities and opportunities. The work that I'm doing in the public school system is more about the gross inequities in predominantly Black urban school systems, and how COVID has decimated the only stability that many of the children, not all, we definitely have kids who are wealthy, kids who are middle class, Black children. I don't want to spread that lie that like we're all struggling and public schools are all struggling, all the kids. It's not that. But definitely what you are seeing on a larger scale in the public school system here is many children of color, because we do have a predominantly Black school system here in Baltimore, and Latinx. You are seeing the role that school plays above and beyond the teaching and learning, and how when those school buildings are closed, especially for long periods of time, you have chronic learning loss, for many of the schools that had, horrible test scores and were really just trying to get through, the very basic curriculum in their schools. You already had those pre-existing dynamics at many of the schools. But you had, and again, I'm not saying all, and there are a lot of success stories in Baltimore schools, and I will never bash my hometown or the schools. And all I'm saying is, you look at any, major city in the United States, you will see these same inequities and who they affect. And it's not an accident. It's not a fluke. It boils down to affecting people who are poor, low income families, not all of whom are people of color, but many of whom are. And it shouldn't be that way. So COVID has absolutely affected my business to the point that, I'm doing non-education related things for, a group of my schools. I'm doing parent engagement activities. I have one tonight. How to support parents in the COVID environment when their children are needing to be home all day virtual learning, and they have to go to work, especially for younger kids who cannot be home during the day. Where are these children going who are in, kindergarten can take off and be home with them. And there are no daycare centers that are open. There are no places that are doing in-person learning. They've tried some experiments with pods and so forth, where kids, like 20 or 30 kids, are meeting in kind of what they're calling these learning pods. There's some really interesting kind of innovations that are happening to deal with what COVID has done. But the bottom line is still a diversity, is still an equity issue, because parents who have to work, whether they're essential workers, first responders, people who have the frontline jobs, tend to look like us. And that means, because of the racial disparities in those, in our employment system, and who gets to do the jobs where they can take off, and be home during the day, or have flexibility or telework, and who has to do the jobs where they show up in person, which means their children, and their families have to figure out very, very difficult things, still falls around racial and class lines. And so now I'm thinking, as a diversity and equity consultant for schools, I'm looking at all these things even more because of COVID. Health disparities. Who's able to get the health care they need in this COVID environment? People who, children in schools who weren't getting immunizations, didn't have access to them. We've set up programs for children to get immunizations in one of my schools. Things like immunizations and other basic health care, are being affected by COVID, and it relates to schools. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up just by saying, for me as an entrepreneur, for me as a female entrepreneur, it has been a great roller coaster ride. Mostly highs, and even the downhills, to use the roller coaster metaphor, have been pretty exhilarating, not necessarily because they're fun, but because they've charged me and challenged me to be better, and to keep climbing once I hit that rock bottom, to keep climbing, because I know there are going to be children, there are going to be families that need access to high quality education. There are going to be teachers who need greater cultural competence, and teachers who are in the trenches, who will need that empowerment and support, that they can keep doing this job. And I want to be ready to go right back up that roller coaster hill with them, and trying to resolve some of those challenges, COVID being one of them as well. And so I'm here, a Black female entrepreneur and education consultant for Higher Learning Group. I don't want to sound cliche. I don't want to say believe in yourself. But I think that is the best advice. Like, take that risk, bet on yourself. We bet on a lot of things. We spend money on a lot of things, and we invest in a lot of other people's ideas, dreams, and visions. We cast our pearls before swine, so to speak, all the time, particularly as women. And we are not always aware of our own greatness. And we're not always aware of the riches that we are expending in the service of somebody else's dream from a day-to-day basis. So trust you are as fabulous as you think you are. You just got to tap into that and go for it. Take that calculated risk, right? Don't just jump out there, think about it. How am I going to approach this? Have a plan. So it's a lot of other pieces of advice mixed in there, but the main thing starts with that inner strength that is there, and that talent that is there, and that greatness. Trust it and go for it. My name is Kaliq Sims. My business is called Higher Learning Group Education Consulting. I can be reached on LinkedIn under Kaliq Sims. I also can be reached most directly through my website, which is www.higherlearning.com. kaliq.higherlearninggroup.com, or by email, which is Kaliq, Kaliq, my first name, at higherlearninggroup.com. Kaliq@higherlearninggroup.com, or you can go to my website, higherlearninggroup.com, or you can hit me up on LinkedIn. I don't check that one as often, so I would say the email is probably the best one.